Upon reaching the barracks area, we began to look around, but it was very easy to see that a lot of the beds had been used. It wasn't like the area that we had found, that everything was fresh and clean, and nothing had been even opened up. We moved across as we moved to each bed looking, and we saw that the beds were stained. Some with dark yellow stains, but others with dark red. There was also stains across the floor, drag marks, it was clear to see. Yet we continued to move forward as we didn't see any bodies. We moved over towards the kitchen area, and we thought we heard something. We all moved very slowly. I tried using the old hand signals I knew, but unfortunately they still didn't understand them. So I had to use as basic as I could to tell everybody to wait, hold on, and follow me in. I took point, flipping the safety off as I moved into the kitchen. Moving around, I could smell something. Something very, very rancid. The hell could smell? Oh, God, that smells like crap. Oh, jeez. Trying to wipe the tears from my eyes as I was moving around. It was terrible. And then I moved over towards the area I thought I smelled it from. I was right. Inside one of the freezers, I looked in as the small little bit of light that came from the emergency lights peered in. So I lifted up my flashlight, clicked it on, and looked inside. The whole place had been cleared out of all its food, at least whatever was being preserved, and on the ground was just piles and piles of feces. At least I think it was. We began to move around to the next area of the kitchen, and then I saw two of our number turn and raise their rifles, looking at the kitchen door. "What'd you see?" "I don't know," they said. Something moved. We moved to the next area of the kitchen where the storage was. Slowly opening the door, we moved inside, and what we found amazed us. There was a child. This young, extremely pale, red-headed child shivering in the corner. It had made itself basically a fort with all the soup cans and everything like that. There were open cans of food all over the floor. This maybe 8-year-old little child was just looking up at us, scared. And we lowered our weapons. I tried to move forward and try to get their attention. "Excuse me, are you okay?" I asked. We were still human enough to have empathy, of course. And none of us were just going to shoot a kid. But the child was simply shaking. The clothes were disheveled, seemingly hadn't been changed in Lord knows how many years. Many of the clothes were either too big or too small, and all of them extremely dirty. The child reeked. The whole area smelled horrible. So I put my weapon down and walked up and kneeled next to it. I introduced myself and held out my hand. Then she slowly reached out and grabbed mine. She introduced herself. Turned out it was a young girl. I asked her where her parents were, and she began to freak out. Then she jumped at me and held on tight. For a moment, I thought she was going to cut the circulation off to my skin, but then again, I'm blue. I wouldn't have been able to tell. Billy came up next to him, and she reached over and started freaking out at the sight of Billy's tail. Of course, he wasn't the only one with the tail or horns or anything of that nature, but for some reason she was afraid. We tried to get as answers as we could, but there wasn't any. I looked over and asked a few of our guys, "Hey, can you take her back while we search the rest of this place?" 3 of our number took her back. They almost had to pry her arms off of me to take her back, but I kept telling her, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. To my surprise, she said, okay, ma'am. I had to chuckle a little bit as I turned to Billy and, do I really look that feminine now? He kind of shrugged it off, but we continued our search. We looked around for any other survivors, but we didn't find much of anything. A couple of discarded bones here and there, and a lot of blood streaks. We couldn't figure out what was going on until one actually turned and said, hey, what about this? Picking up a book, of all things. What does it say? Billy asked. He said, it looks like a diary. Hold on, let me look in this. And he started reading as we continued on. We moved up to the upper levels, but didn't find anything. Most of the upper levels had been torn apart. Something had gone in there. It looked like the old-fashioned bowl in a china shop, as all the cubicles were torn to pieces. There was not a single piece of furniture that wasn't damaged or outright destroyed. Every window was busted, and several of the stone walls had holes in them. Whatever happened here, we were not sure we wanted to know. Staying on the top floor, as that had the most light, we cracked open that diary and we began to read it. As it turns out, it was the diary of a woman, and we listened on as she spoke about how things had changed. Some sort of cyber attack or something like that. They didn't understand what it was, but the electronics around the world had started to go haywire. Something had shut down a lot of things, a lot of electronics. Streetlights didn't work, for that matter. They wondered if it was a CME, some type of solar flare, maybe a terrorist attack. Maybe somebody had just started freaking out and started flipping switches for some reason, as large portions of the continent were without power, but no one knew. It was at that point they ran to these facilities. Many of the people in this facility were workers. They were also realizing very quick that this was an escape route for those who were well off financially. As we read, we discovered the truth about these facilities. They weren't just there for our medical care. It was also there so that everyone could be collected and then brought down to the facility we were currently staying at. The facility where we found all those tire tracks. Everyone would follow the tunnels safely, closing the doors behind them to make sure nothing followed them, and then they would take off in a convoy. I still don't know why they would bug out, considering they had this huge underground expansion. But it is believed by us that this facility was not meant to be permanent, which stands to reason. There's no growing areas for food or anything of that nature. This was a temporary stop. But as we read, we found out that the woman who wrote the diary had got to the facility and with several others found out that the blast doors had been closed and couldn't be opened from the other side. We'd freaked out for a moment until we remembered that we left the door open, and if it was closed, our colleagues would have come back by now. We continued reading, and the woman explained that she was pregnant. She had given birth only 2 days after she had gotten into the facility, and they had tried to stay within the facility as best they could. However, it wasn't long before they found all the reports coming in over what was left of their communications equipment of monsters ripping the world apart. These monsters varied from the massive trolls to some sort of dragons all the way to skinwalkers and such. It seemed like almost everything out of lore, old and new, was coming to life and going after population centers. These creatures, what made them dangerous wasn't their size or their strength, although that actually played a part, but it was the fact that they were smart. The diary noted that there was video that they watched of these monsters would be eating something, and then someone would show up with a firearm, but before the first shot was fired, the creature would take off to the side, wait for the person with the firearm to get close to check the body, and then pounce from another direction taking out the one with the weapon. They were very smart. Smart enough that it made them even more dangerous. We continued to listen as our friend read in the diary as he spoke about how they tried to remain in the facility and simply waited for help. However, help did not arrive before something else. She claimed that different type of creatures had come and tried to break in, eventually starting to crack the windows. Some were massive creatures and started to beat on the side of the walls. We all heard this, looked over at one of the sides, and there was a giant hole in the brick. We also realized that again, there was no glass left in these windows. Something had busted in and tore this place asunder. He continued reading and explained that these creatures had got in and not really attacked each other, but began looking for something. They didn't know what, but everyone tried to stay in the lower areas as they tried to protect themselves. They didn't have much firearms. Whatever they found in the storage locker, sure, but they didn't think it would be enough for whatever the hell was trying to beat its way down into the lower levels. They could hear these creatures pounding on the doors. These were not blast doors. They were fire doors at most. They could hear the door actually being pulled from the other side as the metal itself would groan, and they all would sit there waiting to see if something would come in. During this time, she tried to raise her child as little as they could. They were in the facility for about 4 years before the doors were finally breached. 4 years they stayed down there. 4 years in fear, riding off whatever in the hell they were doing to keep the generators running. We still don't know. We're trying to figure that one out because if they have some special way, then we need to know. Then again, this is the only facility with a backup battery system, it seems like. As he read on, it wasn't long before the creatures began to break through the ceiling, and they also began to rip the doors up. They could see things crawling and slithering and whatever the hell you want to call it on the other side. She mentioned how she was afraid for her daughter, and she told her daughter, if something happens, you stay in that area and you don't move. You stay there. She had taught her daughter how to ration food and how to make sure she could get water. Too bad she didn't teach her too much about hygiene. As we continued on, the last entry came in. As we turned the page, there was only one entry. It stated, God help us, they're almost through the door. I sent my daughter to the back and will make our stand here. I only pray that she makes it, even if I don't. This mama bear is going to protect her cub. If I have to go down, we'll go down swinging. There's only a few of us left anyway. There's 27 of us. We will make our stand here. If anyone finds this, if we don't make it, please take care of my daughter. Please. And that was it. The last word was not even completed on the page. And then I realized something. As he picked up the book the first time when he found it, it looked like it had simply been thrown onto the bed. The pages were flipped open as it was face down against the mattress. We looked at each other and realized that they had made their last stand. Whatever had gotten in had taken them all, but had not checked the back. Maybe it was the fact that the girl was in the freezer and they just didn't know to check the freezer. Maybe for whatever reason, maybe she pulled the Jurassic Park and stayed underneath in the cupboard, waited for everyone to be gone. We don't know. We wouldn't have any answers unless we went back and asked her, which would happen later. For right now, we simply held on to this book as a living memory of those who came before. We would also have to show our colleagues on the other side of the tunnel. However, for right now, it was simply looking out to see if there was anything around the facility we could still use, what we could salvage. There was. Thankfully, the young girl had realized rationing was extremely important and had just sat there, shivering. It's no wonder she didn't talk much. Her mind was probably half broken at this point. Yet there was a lot of food she either couldn't reach or just hadn't reached yet. We took as much as we could for the time being. We would have to come back later for the rest of it. However, as we were getting ready to leave, we heard something. We heard flapping. Like wings. Like wings outside. What the hell was that? We started looking around at the windows. Shadows moved. This put us all on high edge. And I just heard Billy say, "We gotta get out of here." Without another word, we all rushed downstairs as quickly and quietly as we could. Something was there, and I didn't want to tangle with whatever had tore this building apart. We finally got down to the broken door and realized that the door wasn't just pulled off its hinges. The door was missing. Something was really big and really strong. This was not something we wanted to tangle with. Grabbing what we could, we headed to the blast door. We went into the blast door and went to close it. The mechanism groaned, but it didn't close. What the hell? A few of us went out, grabbed the blast door, and then hit the button and tried to push it so it would close. Nothing. It wouldn't move. It wouldn't budge. Oh crap, we can't leave this thing open. Now what do? We could hear more movement from the stairway. Something knew we were here, or at least knew something was about. We realized that we needed to do something and do something quick. Looking around for anything, finally, someone got the idea to simply push the door all the way open, and there was a satisfying chunk at the end. We had not realized the door had not opened the entire way. This must have been some sort of safety mechanism as we hit the shut valve, and immediately the door began to close. We took a sigh of relief. And then we saw something come down the stairs. Something monstrous. It was a chimera of sorts, some sort of mix between mammalian parts, reptilian parts. I could barely get a look at it. It kind of walked like a big tiger, but it had the coloring almost of a puma. It had some sort of snake-like head, and the front claws were that of talons. The tail was definitely reptilian, but we couldn't figure out what was going on, and the damn thing had 2 sets of wings on it. 2 sets. One in the front, one in the back, both large. And it wasn't until it turned sideways before it noticed us that we saw the wings. It flared its wings out in kind of a threatening display. As the door began to shut, it charged at us, but it stopped itself, sliding as the door shut closed. We didn't even hear it thump into the door. Whatever this was, it was big, dangerous, and smart. We didn't wait to find out what. We immediately hightailed it out of there. In some of our cases, that's a little more literal. We got finally to the central area, and then we found our own tunnel and ran up the tunnel, finding our own sentries at the top waiting for us. When we got there, all we kept saying is, "Close the door, close the door, close the damn door!" And the blast door was shut. We went upstairs and told everybody what had happened, and they were simply amazed at what was going on. They all freaked out at the idea of the spiders getting loose, but they had to be several kilometers out. Spiders don't like sunlight anyway, so maybe they only attack things when they come into the nest. We didn't know. However, we knew they were very dangerous. And whatever that flying chimera-looking thing was still something we did not want to tangle with. We may be armed, but bullets are precious at this point. The young ones were able to console the young girl as best we could. They cleaned her up, and we could finally see she wasn't brunette, but instead had red hair, extremely pale, with very, very light amount of freckles. We made sure that she was going to be able to get close to the sun so she'd get some sort of vitamin D aside from the fluorescent lights, half of which were broken when we found her. We knew it would take a few more trips to get the resources we needed. However, we had to make sure everything was ready. We got the carts, we grabbed pretty much every weapon we could, and we made it back down the tunnels. This time, we knew exactly which one to go for. It wasn't until we got to the very end where things got very, very quiet. On the way there, we were all laughing and joking, as it were. However, once we got to that door, everyone got ready. Clicking the door open, we could hear the mechanism whine slowly as it tried to get the bolts out of place. Whatever was wrong with this door, the mechanisms were having issues. With the ka-chunk of the bolts moving, the door began to open slowly. We all raised our rifles, and you could hear the satisfying sound of safeties being clicked off as the door slowly opened. We kept those that came to help and to carry things to the back, and the door opened to an empty room again. We moved up slowly, very slowly, as we made our ways to the staircase so that we could get to the supplies. Slowly, slowly we made it through, even slower as we went. As we finally got to where the food finally was, a few of our party began to gag from the stench of bad food and feces that had been smeared all over. People looked at the old blood smears on the ground and realized that this is where they had made their stand. But the odd thing was, we didn't see any brass, no spent casings. How could they have not fired a shot? It didn't make sense. How in the hell was that even possible? We didn't really care. We simply went and got as much of the food as we could possibly get out of there, throwing a few of the swollen cans off to the side, of course, and anything that was clearly past its available date was cast off, and we moved out. As we began to make our way down to the staircase to finally load up the last of it, we could hear laughter. But not the laughter of a child, nor the laughter of a human. This was a low, slow laugh with a strange high pitch behind it. We looked around. Something was off. Something was here. It laughed again, but this time it wasn't alone. There was more laughing that came to be. We started to rush everyone down towards the stairs. Something was here. Something was in this building. There was more laughter, and then we realized it was coming from upstairs. Something realized we were here, and something was chuckling. Something was talking. We started moving down the stairs, and then something hit me. Something fell on me, and I fell forward, falling onto my rifle as something that was latched onto my head was laughing and kicking and scraping and going down my back. Another one landed on the midsection of my back and started tearing at me. I flipped over as fast as I could, but this thing was still on me. Reaching up, I grabbed what I thought was its mandibles. I grabbed two small squishy arms and I began to pull them apart, screaming, "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" And then I heard several shots ring out and blood splattered as more of these things just jumped down and started slashing at us, coming out of everywhere. We couldn't figure out what was going on. Being confined in the staircase, we were thrashing around as much as we could. I finally was able to reach over, grab my weapon, but unfortunately it was aimed almost directly at me. When I reached up, I could feel the barrel up against the side of my forearm. I forced it off to the side instinctively, and it went off. The bullet ricocheted down the hallway. And I looked at what had grabbed it. It was a fucking goblin. A goblin straight out of a freaking TV show. What the hell is this? And there was more of them. Much more. They kept coming. More of them and more of them. They kept running up, laughing and jumping down. We started thrashing as best we could. I finally was able to pry my weapon onto their hands and just swung it like a baseball bat with one hand as I crushed one of their heads against the side. The spray of fluid went across and scared a few of them away, yet others kept coming. Strength in numbers, I guess, as I looked up, made sure the safety was off, and I began to blast up the hallway, shooting through these little bastards. The little 5.56 round going straight through one, into another, passing through it, and into a third. These things were meant to pierce, and with these small bodies of the goblins, it made short work of each one it struck. I reached up, and one of them was grabbing at Bill. It was trying to rip Bill's clothes off. What the hell? They were pulling at his tail as he was trying desperately to thrash himself forward. He was stuck on the ground on all fours as he was trying desperately to get up. They were clawing at him and biting him, trying to make sure he couldn't lift himself up. Each time they bit into him, he would thrash sideways and fall over. I realized this, got over top of him and started kicking and thrashing and screaming and spitting as best I could. Another one jumped up on me and landed up, grabbing onto my hair, started pulling me off to the side, starting to claw at my eyes. I flipped sideways, smashing my head against the wall, crushing its ribs. I could hear audible crack as it did, and this thing yelped in pain. This strange sound came out of it, and it was almost pain, but almost pleasure in this freaking scary thing. I realized that some of our number were being dragged back upstairs, kicking and screaming by 15 to 20 of these frickin' things. It wasn't just me now, but several of our number had actually come up and started helping thrashing at these frickin' goblins. How many of them were there? We started grabbing our own people and basically playing a tug-of-war. Thankfully, we were a lot larger, and we didn't just yanked as hard as we could, and we were able to pull them forward. We got them down the stairs and into the doorway, and that's when the goblins realized we had more on our side than they had anticipated for. As the doorway restricted their number coming through, we simply shot them, kicked them, punched them, threw blades, anything we could we threw at them, and eventually one of our number actually got the genius idea of throwing something really big into the doorway. As the doorway immediately went to a solid 90-degree turn just outside, this large cart that he had brought slowed them down considerably. That was our cue. We grabbed as many as we could, and we got the resources in the tunnel. As we backed up into the tunnel, you could hear shots ringing out. Well, the ringing in the ears was so much so that you almost couldn't hear anything after the first few shots, but we continued to back up, shooting these things as we went. They became more and more voracious. They went from laughing to screaming and growling as they began to fan out around the room. There was no way we could actually shoot them all the way they were coming in, so we backed up all the way to the doorway, and I just heard, "Run!" as somebody had already hit the mechanism to close the door. When we saw the door closing, I grabbed one of the men next to me as he hadn't noticed, and I dragged him by the shoulder back. We ran through the door just as it was starting to get too small to get through, and we finally saw these goblins coming in, and they came in as a flood of sickly green, almost scaly skin, as these things with disgusting teeth started screaming at us. We fired a couple shots down just trying to get them back. A few of them actually tried to make it in through the door, and the door mechanism itself slowly crushed them in between it. And the sounds of bones crackling as the fluids began to spew out on both sides of the door was actually very calming. Only one of the goblins had made it through, and then realized that it was the only one, and had a true look of "oh shit" on its face as it realized what was going on. Without skipping a beat, Bill, who had lost almost all the clothing south of his chest, looked up at this thing, and it looked at him again in fear. Bill then reached up with his hand, closed his fist, came down as hard as he could on the goblin's head, and there was an audible crack as the power went through the goblin's head and into its neck and spine, cracking several vertebrae. On the ground, it squealed in pain, but it could barely move as part of the vertebrae had already severed. Only one arm was still functional as it went around, and Bill raised his foot up and stomped clean on its neck. Then it stopped moving. We looked at each other, started counting up, seeing who was injured. What the hell were these things after? They weren't after our food. Why were they attacking us? What the hell was wrong with these things? As everyone's adrenaline began to subside, we made sure that we made a mental note to never go to that area again. We wondered as we walked how the young girl had survived these things, and then we realized something. We were making a lot of noise. A lot of noise. These goblins must have been attracted to it. How could there be so many? What the hell were feeding so many? And why did they try to take us alive? That made even less sense. A few theories were spit out as we went. However, most everyone was just concerned with getting the hell away from there as fast as they could. When we finally got back, we told everybody what had happened. We told them that the world is even more dangerous than we ever thought. However, now we knew the truth. Our modifications that we had were not due to some rich kid going in and changing the code. They were not due to any sort of craziness of some malicious person. Not deliberately anyway. But simply the change of the code itself. At least now we know the truth. We looked at the group and everyone was in deep contemplation of this. And I wondered, were we human enough to deal with the truth?